Before I left here, I was cleaning out my office at McGill. I think they tolerated my presence there for a long, long time, but I knew eventually the boom would come down and I'd be told I had to somehow dispose of a whole lifetime of stuff. Much of it is being archived, actually, by McGill Library. And I came across some UN report that looked quite old from the 1950s, and it was called On the Problem of Development and Trade. And I think it was very well titled, because development, from the time it has come onto the agenda, has been most intimately related to issues of trade. Because all what we now call developing countries at that time were exporters of primary products in the traditional division of labor and importers of manufactures from the so-called industrialized countries. Now, of all the definitions of economic development, I think the one provided by the late Alice Amsden is the most interesting and useful. And it goes something like this, not literally. It goes to say that economic development is a move from assets of agricultural and other natural resources exploited with unskilled labor to knowledge assets exploited by skilled labor. And in this, manufacturing plays, of course, the most important role, because it is in manufacturing that the capacities for the ability to develop the capacities for more knowledgeable and skilled labor are nurtured. Now, she also has written a book that is she's written many books. I think the most famous one was her book on the rise of South Korea, the next giant, but in a more popular vein, something called Escape from Empire. And in that book, she made the division between the first 30 years after the Second World War and then the following 30 years. The first 30 years, which our friend Surendra Patel, I think, named very well, called it the taming of capitalism, and the subsequent 30 years, which in the same book I call the unleashing of capital. So we are in that first era. So starting from the beginning of the development project after the end of the Second World War, as I say, almost all of the trade that it was moving, and it was the majority of stuff moving across the seas were primary products. And the principal source of them was were the Americas, including North America, Canada, but of course also Latin America, which at that time had an average GDP in real terms adjusted and so forth, roughly equaling that of Mediterranean Europe. Some other primary products also came, of course, from Africa and North Africa and India and other countries. India at that time was very, very much poorer, and China was so poor, having been so impoverished by the imperialist no, I'm not going there, not going into history. I would use up too many of my 15 minutes. But China was extremely poor, the poorest country in the world without question, at the time of the revolution in 1949. Now, in the decades which followed, there was industrialization, and there was, in some countries, a change in the composition of exports from being totally primary to including also some manufacturing. We're going to follow these patterns of industrialization, and I am suggesting that there are at least three important varieties to be looked at here. Starting with the well-known case of Latin America, which was industrialization almost exclusively for the domestic market. It had started in the 1930s and 40s. The well-known story, those of you who are familiar with the Latin American economic development. And it was then suggested that even when the special conditions of depression and war were no longer generating industrial development for the domestic market, this should be continued. It's generally called import substituting industrialization, and it continued into the 50s, 60s, and 70s and gave a very high growth rate to Latin America at that time. Now, this, because it was targeted to the domestic market, and much of the source of the increasing income came from the export of primary products throughout all of this year, there were very few manufactured exports. In fact, in the 1950s, it would be very hard to find any kind of manufactures being exported from any regions of the global south. In the colonial countries, it was a total no-no. It was inconceivable. Now, the next model of industrialization, I think important, of course, was India. It was very different. And the Indian industrialization, in some ways, was modeled on that of the Soviet Union in the sense of building heavy industry, steel and chemical plants, steel plants, capital goods industries, as well as consumer industries, mostly with domestic resources. The growth rate was slow, but it was a building from the bottom up. And India was at the forefront of discussions of development issues at that time, as was Latin America, of course, principally Prebisch and the group of younger people around him at Sepal. That was an entirely different development model, and it was also targeted at the domestic market principally. Now, the next important model came a little bit later, and I'm talking about the East Asian model. I'm not yet talking about China, but particularly Korea and Taiwan, which Korea very much modeled on Japan. Japan, of course, was the first country in Asia to begin to challenge Western total supremacy. That was as early as 1905. We're not going there right now either, although it is very fascinating history. So in the case of Korea, starting in the 60s and particularly in the 70s, a model very different from that of Latin America, very different from that of India, but it modeled on China, on Japan, and in this case, they were earning the foreign exchange which was required to purchase imports and technology at the same time as they were building, almost from scratch, the most modern, technologically advanced industrial structures, like the world's largest steel plant, most modern and biggest shipyards, and they may say South Korea before that was an agricultural country. So it was, the model is best described by Alice Amsden. It was again well described by Hajun Chang. Some of you are totally familiar with it, but it's very different from the Latin American story, import substitution, while growth generated from primary exports, very different from India. Now, fast forward. Just because I don't have much time, let me fast forward basically to the 90s and to the crisis. When the crisis hit in the financial crisis, 2008, but 2009 was really the year. And then the world woke up again in 2010 as to what would be the consequences. The world was surprised. The IMF was surprised. They made so many revisions to their estimates. It is clear that they were not expecting what actually had happened, which was that the impact on the heartlands of capitalism, both in the United States and in Europe, were very much more severe than had been anticipated. In fact, they had not anticipated even the advent of the crisis. But in the developing world, with the single very important exception of what I call the southern periphery of the United States, consisting of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, those countries were hard hit. Asia was hardly affected. Strangely, Africa, likewise, the rest of Latin America, it dipped down to zero a little bit, bounced right up again, and in 2010, I think 25 or 30 of the largest metropolitan cities in the world ranked in terms of their recovery, in terms of income and employment. All the top cities were mostly Asian, then the rest were Latin American in the first 30, I think. It's in my book, I can't remember the exact detail. But there's a funny little detail that at the bottom of the 30, the first that turns up that is not in Asia or Latin America is Montreal. One often wondered about that, perhaps because it's an educational center, I don't know, that was not so much affected by the crisis as other countries. Anyway, and then we have, of course, the 2000s, in which we see an average growth rate in a decade of Asia, the so-called developing Asia, that is all of it, of around 8 or 9% per annum, averaging a decade, and embracing half the population of the world, as compared with what we know happened in Europe and in the West. Now, I want to come back, and I want to pick up on what Gavin said about my book, Silent Surrender, and the issue of the importance of foreign investment in industrialization. Because the kind of industrialization that we saw and the manner in which, let us say, South Korea and those Asian countries were able to benefit from the fact that trade was increasing twice as fast as output since about the 80s. Let's call that trade globalization. They were beneficiaries. They were able to strategically ride that tide, as compared with those countries which whose drive was not autonomous, whose capital formation was not domestic, which, so to speak, passively were plugged into the outsourcing of manufacturing from the United States, particularly in the 1980s and 90s. And most particularly the 90s. 1994 is a key date. It's a date of the signing of NAFTA, the template for all these so-called free trade agreements, which are not so much about trade as about tearing down all kind of barriers that countries may have in order to forward their economic development. It is also the date at which the GATT was transformed into the World Trade Organization. I think it was also the date at which Bush announced that he intended to extend this North American trade agreement to embrace all of South America, which never happened. So we come to see the Mexican. Let me come back to Latin America. We were talking about this before. You're giving me a notice.
3 minutes, yes.
3 minutes? Okay, fine. Yeah. So we have, let's say, the Mexican variant of Mexican story on industrialization, in 30 years or so of the politics dominated by the PRI, had a considerable amount of industrialization. There was agricultural exports, including corn. There was indigenous industries, considerable, with a certain amount of technological local development, which was really destroyed by the Mexican adherence to NAFTA, which destroyed much of the corn production, which turned Mexico to some degree into an importer of corn, the main cereal staple, but it also destroyed, not only in that year, but even in previous years, domestic industrial capacity for the maquiladora things along the American border, employing, as Raul told me, 2.3 million people only, having displaced a great deal more than that. But it's not a matter of numbers only, it is a matter of the quality. And finally, we have the fact that in Latin America, the industrialization has, from the beginning, as I understand, considerably relied on foreign investment. That's the Canada story. But also initially on state enterprises. That Brazil, according to UNIDO, had a similar level of industrialization as South Korea in 1980, with a lot of state enterprise, considerable multinational FDI, but a rather weak domestic private sector. Amson is very interesting, stresses this very much, the importance of national firms, whether they are private or public or corporate or whatever, as distinct from branches of multinationals, which don't develop local research and R&D. And of course, the proof of the fact how inferior is development with multinational corporations is our own country here, Canada itself, which has now embraced under Mr. Harper this doctrine that is going to be the world's principal resource extracting country, and has let everything else go to pot. We had a few very good technology companies here. We had the Nortel. We still have the BlackBerry guy. What is it? Something in motion. But the government never gave it any support. Never gave Nortel any support. Canada's at the bottom of R&D of all industries in the OECD. It is an example of how not to industrialize successfully. So I've made these comments partly in response to some of the things that have been said here earlier yesterday, very interesting, the issue of so-called reprimatization of Latin America. On that, I would only say that I have looked recently at the figures, and it is remarkable that the increase in commodity prices from the early 2000s and to 2011, fourfold increase in metals and twofold increase in food, I think is considerably amount to speculate. A lot of it is financial capital moving into speculative investment, moving into real property, moving into acquisition of land, acquisition, engagement in minerals, which can be stored, of course, gold particularly, and others, but not only that, but land also in the sense of properties, desirable urban development, displacing poor people to put up condominiums and stuff for the more well-to-do, and infrastructure of a kind that rent can be collected. Because, final word, I learned from Eric Cairns, whose report I also found when I dug up my library, who is, some of you may know, or who was, coming from the business world. He was head of the Montreal Stock Exchange. He was a minister of government in both Quebec and in Ottawa. He was engaged by Schreier of the NDP in the 1980s to advise on natural resource policy. He studied the matter. He found 3 huge corporations in metal mining dominating Manitoba. He looked into the books. He concluded that the profitability was enormous in mining, not so much refining or smelting, that this profit was more in the nature of rent, rather than profit in any normal sense of the word, and recommended that Manitoba nationalize and create a crown corporation for all exploration of mineral resources and all exploitation of them, which, needless to say, was not adopted by the NDP government. And Eric Cairns, who was a colleague of mine and a friend, but certainly no socialist, has left us a legacy of this report, which I wanted to show you, but I can do so afterwards, just as a reminder of the kind of imaginative thinking that did exist in this country, even though it was quite a long time ago. Thank you.